You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYFI.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I am your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how are you doing?
I'm doing excellent, dialing in from a warm and nice cafe in southern France.
I like your location a bit better than mine, although last week I was gallivanting around Iceland and the Faroe Islands, so I'm really happy to be back. It's good to see you. I'm excited to jump into the news. What did I miss? I feel so disconnected from everything.
No, but it's been 3 weeks since you were on, so the entire world has changed.
It seems that way, at least.
It seems that way, and yet everything stays the same. I mean, if we take what I think is the most pertinent issue that boiled over here during the weekend, the U.S. Canada trade spat. Sure, Canada-U.S. trade war has now been ongoing longer than any of the other trade wars, apart from the one with Mexico, and it then blew up here over the weekend. Canada was going to come in with a Digital Services Act, which actually is not new. It's an act that they passed a year ago, but June 30th, today, was the first day that there was going to be payments done on this one, and that seemed to have set off President Trump, who then stopped immediately all trade negotiations with Canada. And then late Sunday evening, the Canadian government seems to have backed down, and I don't know whether they have completely scrapped the Digital Service Act or whether it's on pause or whether it's now a bargaining chip alongside the whole deal. But at least that's the latest one in terms of what blew up. And I think from that perspective, yes, it's new. And yes, it's not new at all, because this seems to have been the way of the U.S. global trade war now ever since Trump took office. That every week there is a new twist, there is a new turn, which simply makes long-term supply chain planning almost impossible. Last week, we also heard talks from the U.S. government in terms of maybe not, they will postpone the July 9th pause on the tariffs. No one has the slightest clue whether that's going to happen. We have also heard announcements from Trump that he will then, over the next week and a half, start to issue new tariff levels for a lot of the different countries, perhaps instead of the old reciprocal tariff levels. We can guess all we want whether that will happen or not. The reality is no one has the slightest clue. And therefore, the supply chain set up specifically for U.S. importers it is impossible to do any kind of long-term planning. That's really unchanged.
Yeah. From what I was seeing, the rates are looking, based on what Trump has said, anywhere from like 10% to 50%. So it's a pretty large range to be working with here.
Yes.
And for the Digital Services Act, I wanted to ask, is that related at all to physical cargo, or is it more of an impact on the actual trade talks between the two countries?
No, the Digital Services Act, as I understand, the one they've done in Canada is they basically say, well, anybody who sells virtual services, that could be, for example, think Netflix as an example. Anyone that sells digital services into Canada, they were going to pay, I believe it was 3% of the revenue that they bring in from Canadian customers as a digital service tax in Canada. The EU is contemplating something similar. And I think what set this off is the trade war that the US has basically picked with the entire world is 100% focused on physical goods. Sure, the US has a trade deficit with the rest of the world when it comes to physical goods. But what has not been part of the trade war discussion is the fact that the US has a massive trade surplus when it comes to services. Because you got all these digital services, your Netflix, your Facebook, your LinkedIn, all these digital services, they create a massive trade surplus with the US. They are not part of the trade war, except that now they became part of the trade war, in this case with Canada. And as I mentioned, the EU is contemplating something similar.
Yeah, a bit of a creative solution to a country that doesn't export quite as much cargo as some of these other ones. All right, well, let's shift into some of the rates that we're seeing. Where's the NYFI at?
Yeah, you say the NYFI increased marginally when you're looking at the Trans-Pacific, which we mainly have been looking at the last month and a half, which was basically expected because we saw the quoted spot rates peak a few weeks ago as well, and then they dropped sharply. And I would say this was the last tiny increase that we were going to see. If you look at the actual rates being paid for cargo that has been loaded, it is still about $1,000 below what the quotes seemed to indicate a couple of weeks ago. So the trend that we saw last week continues into this week. that a lot of the extremely high quotes from several weeks ago actually did not really materialize for a lot of the cargo. Either nobody booked at those quotes, or to the degree they did, they reneged on them and rebooked at much lower rates. So the NYFI definitely still also confirms that the injection of a lot of capacity in anticipation of a surge is now backfiring because the capacity is finally here, and now suddenly the shippers have changed their mind. So the NYFI, I would say, has peaked here, and I would be very confident that when we get the next reading here at the end of the week, we will also see that one start to decline again for the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah, and I think last week or maybe the week before, Don used the quote that customers are shopping around a bit. And I think what we see with the
Yes.
discrepancy in the rates kind of shows that you're going to have, these really large numbers in terms of quotes, but you're not always moving them. And that's why you're seeing this discrepancy between what's actually moved.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing I would like to do, I mean, since we haven't done it so far, is maybe have a look at the Atlantic, because that's where we got NYFI index as well. And interestingly, we got them in both directions, both eastbound and westbound. So I picked one graph to show. Again, let's not bore everybody looking here with lots of graphs. But what we're looking at here is the Atlantic spot rates from the beginning of May up until now. And if you're looking at the Atlantic eastbound rates, that's basically U.S. exports back over to Europe, it's holding firm. I mean, sure, it's going up a little bit, down a little bit, but basically it's the same. The interesting bit here is when I start to look at it, what happened on the Atlantic westbound? Why did we suddenly see a spike? And again, keep in mind, this spike we're seeing in the middle of June, that is for cargo that is actually loaded. So somebody is suddenly paying a massive premium. And at first I was scratching my head and said, what goes on? Because this is not linked to seasonality. There was no change in tariff policy either during this one. And then it struck me, maybe the answer was to be found if we look at capacity. And interestingly enough, this spike coincides with there was a short-term but very significant drop in capacity offered by the shipping lines. I don't have a good explanation as to why that drop was there. That might have been phasing in, phasing out of ships, but it actually does correspond to a temporary situation where there was a lot less capacity than we usually see. And yes, that did translate into higher spot rates. And the moment that was resolved, which again was basically a week later, we immediately also see the rate come back down to where it usually was.
All right, interesting insights. I think these deep dives are really useful for our listeners to understand for specific trades what's happening, and even in this like shorter term chart, looking how it either stays steady or when there's peaks and valleys, like what might be impacting that. So really interesting observations.
And I think what is also interesting going forward, if we look back over especially the last 5 years, time and time again, there are these discussions in terms of do freight rates really follow supply and demand or not? And what we're beginning to see here, if we actually measure freight rates on the cargo loaded, it appears that there might be a much stronger link here between actual rates paid and then the supply demand situation on the ground than maybe the quoted rates in the past were given credit for.
All right, thanks for sharing some of those insights on the Atlantic trade. Is there anything interesting going on some of the other deep sea trades?
You can say the Asia-Europe trade, not much interesting is happening. We've seen an increase and it continues to slowly increase. It's nothing massive, but it does show that there is strength in that market. Demand has been held up very nicely on the Asia-Europe trade. So I would not expect to see any kind of sudden downwards movement. It is a solid trade. It's moving up slowly.
I know you've mentioned in the past that there's congestion in a lot of the European ports.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask if you see that reflected in the rate, or if it's more of like an after effect, not necessarily something that would cause the rate to be shifting upwards.
Yeah, in itself, it would not cause the rate to shift upwards because it's at the destination end. The only situation where this would cause the rate to shift upwards is if it becomes so bad, so you got a lot of ships tied up, so you can't make it back to Asia, and therefore you're restricting capacity, you're starting to blank sailings. But that's not the pattern that we're seeing emerging now. So the port congestion in Europe is more of, let's call it, a nuisance factor for the importers that can't get their cargo on time.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, and then anything more to say about the Asia-Europe trade?
Not for the Asia-Europe trade, but I still think the Asia to East Coast South America trade is showing very, very interesting developments. If you look at the SCFI spot rate, for example, it is now above $6,200 TEU, not per FFE, but per TEU, which is extremely high. It's not pandemic level high, but it is indeed very, very high. And I think it's a combination of you're seeing very strong surge of demand going into East Coast South America, and you're not really seeing much of a capacity injection at this point in time. So of all the major deep sea trades out there, Asia to East Coast South America is extremely tight presently.
And I know a lot of people will talk about, like, for the Trans-Pacific trade, they'll say, like, you know, the average used to be, like, I don't know, $1,000, $1,500. Like, that was kind of the normal. I'm curious if there was, like, a normal type of rate, using air quotes, for Asia to East Coast South America. Like, what would be kind of pre-COVID, maybe what you could expect to pay back in those days?
That is actually an extremely good question. Off the top of my head, I actually can't remember it. So why don't we kick it off to the side and you ask me that one in our podcast next week? I'm sure I'll have a good answer for you.
All right. We'll take a note of that one. Sounds good. All right. Have we covered all the trade lanes? What are we missing here?
No, I think these are the main developments on the trade lanes here as we are approaching what is the typical peak season. So I think we're in good shape for all the trade lanes right now.
Okay. And so every week there seems to be some geopolitical update in the news, some more directly related to shipping, others maybe not so much, but good to be aware of. Are there any geopolitical issues or updates to kind of touch on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two updates we should touch on. One is, of course, the ceasefire in the Iran-Israel war, which for all intents and purposes is great news. And that means the risk of a sudden, let's call it commercial blockage of the Strait of Hormuz is off the table for now. It never actually ended up having any material impact, which is also good news, but that was touch and go, it seems, for a while. But for now, that one at least is off the table, which is nice. But as I think what I have mentioned on various other occasions is, the geopolitical situation is prone to a lot of local conflicts flaring up. And this week saw another one of those that nobody really tends to think about. A border issue between Thailand and Cambodia all of a sudden flared up, with the effect that right now the border is closed. The land border between Thailand and Cambodia completely closed to cargo, to goods, but also to tourists and everybody else. This is not a major impact on global shipping, but for some container shippers, it actually does have real impact, because there's a lot of cargo to and from Cambodia that's shipped via some of the ports over in Thailand, which obviously you can't do over land right now. If you're using the Thai ports to get to and from the Cambodian market, you would now have to transship and ship it into Cambodia, or shift your supply chain and go via Vietnam instead.
Gotcha. So do you have any advice for any shippers that might be impacted by this, other than maybe reach out to your carrier providers? I'm sure they're already hearing from them in terms of, what you should be maybe considering at this point.
Yeah, exactly. The main thing to consider here is, if you were planning on moving cargo over land between Thailand and Cambodia, look immediately for another option. There are definitely other options. As I said, you can transship, or you can go via Vietnam. There are definitely options, but how long this dispute will last is also unknown presently.
Okay, you answered my question before I asked it. All right, so we'll keep an eye on it and report when we have some news there. Anything else to talk about today?
No, I think we covered a lot of the main topics as it is. Maybe we should rejoice that finally this is one of the podcasts where there's not a major geopolitical conflict, or rather there was a cooling off of a major geopolitical conflict, in this case with Iran, Israel. We should celebrate the small wins as well.
I agree, and perhaps not even that small, but yeah, we do focus a lot on, what the news is telling us, all the bad conflicts and things that are happening. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a good thing to point out. We sort of just glossed over it, so good call out there. Well, I think we covered everything today. We'll be back, of course, next week. Be sure to rate us and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and I hope everyone has an awesome week.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.